Okay, I will start now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining in time. We already have around 60 participants and we've had more than 200 registered participants, so we'll have a couple of more, but still we want to use the time. Warm welcome, everyone. My name is Gisha Schifferdecker. I'm a communications manager at EFI, European Forest Institute, and please excuse my Janis Joplin voice. I've just recently recovered from, or I'm just recovering from COVID, so it is a little darker than usual, but nevertheless, I'm really happy to welcome you all here. We will start with a short introduction to this series, and this is the first time that we have a monthly forest restoration talk. I would like to introduce you why we came up with that idea and what are we aiming at with this series, with this monthly series. It's a series hosted by the Superb project, and we will hear more about that project in the next episode in December. And the IUFRO task force, on just a second. I'm struggling with my laptop.
If I may help you.
Yes, please.
Forest landscape restoration for future climates and human well-being.
Yes,
not a very handy title.
Yeah, transforming forest landscape. Yeah, I had problems with my screen here. The IUFRO task force transforming forest landscapes for future climates and human well-being. And the idea behind it is to have a timely scientific exchange across disciplines and to have an open discussion on approaches, benefits, and also challenges related to forest restoration and also adaptation. And with this series, we plan to target researcher, practitioners, NGO, policymakers, also potential donors. So everyone who's involved in forest restoration and is important for forest restoration, because it's a quite broad topic, as well as the stakeholders engaged in the topic. And we want to learn from each other. We want to investigate different questions related to forest restoration from diverse scientific perspectives. And we will have an alternating focus on the global level, which will be represented by the IUFRO task force, and the European level, which will be represented by the Superb projects. And we will also have different formats. That's the plan. So we will have this time a very rather classical format with a next slide, please, with a presentation. Then we will have the chance to answer questions. First of all, I should have said in the beginning, this webinar is recorded, but you've also been informed about that when you entered the Zoom. So I suppose you're all aware of that, but still we want to let you know, and you can also watch it or hopefully recommend it afterwards, because we will publish it on the EFI YouTube account and on the IUFRO website. And this time we will have a presentation, and next time we will also have a presentation, then a Q&A, but in the future, and we will tell you more about the upcoming formats at the end of this webinar. We will also have potentially panel discussions. We will have pro and contra discussions. So we'll have a diversity also of formats to tackle the topics related to forest restoration. We will also have potentially not only scientific perspectives, but also perspectives from other stakeholders concerned with forest restoration. For questions to John, please use the dedicated Q&A box. You will find it on the bottom of your Zoom. You can also already put the questions in the Q&A while John is talking. It's always better to do it right away before you forget about the question. And after the presentation, we will promote you. When we've selected your question, we will promote you to be a speaker so that you can ask your question live. So for some questions, we decided to ask them live. So please be prepared when you ask a question that we will put you live on air. And in case you don't want that, you can also indicate that just in the Q&A. And if you want to tweet about the webinar, please tag us, either IUFRO or Super Project, in the best case, the two of us, and then we can retweet you and we can spread the news. And we have almost 100 participants now, so I'm happy to hand over now to my colleague Andreas Bolte from IUFRO. And sorry again for the messed up screen.
Thank you, Gesche, for the nice introduction. Hello, good afternoon, but also perhaps also good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's really a pleasure for me to moderate this session. And I'm Andreas Bolte. I'm working at the Thünen Institute of Forest Ecosystem in Germany, in Eberswalde, but I'm also the coordinator of the task force with the already mentioned name, Transforming Forest Landscape for Future Climates and Human Well-Being. And perhaps I would also like to say some words about IUFRO itself, because perhaps not everybody of you are familiar with it. So IUFRO is the world's largest forest research organization, so to say. It's a member organization with more than 650 members in more than 120 countries and covering about 15,000 scientists which are working in these member organizations. So it's a powerful and extensive network with different divisions, different disciplines which are covered. But one quite new idea is to have task forces, and task forces try to tackle more or less complex problems by interdisciplinary groups, transdisciplinary work, and so on. And so to say, it's more or less something one side of the idea which is brought up with this idea of this monthly forest restoration talks. So our task force started in 2019, but even before we had a task force on forest restoration. And we have now about 50 to 60 members from all 5 continents. And I'm a silviculturist, I'm a forest ecologist, and I started just with the idea, okay, forest restoration as a biophysical or a technical action, but I've learned very much that it's perhaps much more a societal or a political aspect, which is very important. And just to say some catchwords like governance, land tenure, justice, equality, but also aspects of participation, very important, participation of the local people, because at the end, you may plant trees, but it's important to keep the forest by supporting the people to learn to live with the forest and from the forest, and to keep the forest also after several decades. And I think this is the major aims, to transform the landscapes to providing more ecosystem services. So with this, I would like to introduce our speaker, who is more or less, I think, the perfect person to introduce more in the broad field, because he has worked for more than 3 decades in different positions, also on the international forest landscape restoration. John Stanturf has worked for more, I think, 26 years for the US Forest Service, and he was responsible for international forest landscape restorations action activities. And I think you cannot avoid to work in this field and not to read some of his numerous books and articles. So he is more or less omnipresent, I think, in this field. And after he has been retired, I think in 2019, he has become more active, I would say. So it was not a retirement, it was an active ment, so to say, because he has now launched a new startup called Innova Silva, together with colleagues, to promote forest restoration all over the world. And he is also visiting professor now at Estonian University of Life Science in Tartu. And now, of course, he is on tour. He will more or less speak to us. He's now in Uzbekistan, all on the tour and promoting forest landscape restoration. So with this, I would like to hand over to you, John. So the floor is yours, and we are really keen to hear what you want us to say.
Excuse me, that's John Stanturf. I'm coming to you by this recording because I'm traveling in Uzbekistan and apparently I don't have a good internet connection. Today I want to talk about if nature is the solution, what's the question? And I'm going to provide a perspective from forest landscape restoration. I'm going to offer my viewpoint from that perspective, or as it's commonly abbreviated, FLR. First, the problem. We seem to be living through continuous crises, or what's been called a polycrisis, where multiple simultaneous systemic crises intensify as they collide and co-occur. Every day we read headlines about extreme weather, pandemics, social unrest, and military conflicts. Through all this turmoil, it may be easy to lose sight of the existential crisis for humanity, the loss and degradation of natural systems by pollution, land use change, and a warming and, frankly, less predictable climate. In the last 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution in the Neolithic, we've lost an estimated 1/3 of global forest and woodland cover, estimated at over 2 billion hectares. Environmental and climate changes continue today, rapidly altering the growth, survival, and regeneration conditions for forest ecosystems with direct and very dramatic impacts on 3.2 billion people. And these include the most vulnerable people in societies. This land use change has been to accommodate increased human populations. Now, I've seen the world's population increase 3 times in my lifetime, so another doubling by the end of this century is not far-fetched. Long term, then, we can frame the question in a different way as how do we provide ecosystem services and livelihoods for twice the current population, while at the same time reversing the destruction of the ecosystems that sustain life? Now, I'm not arrogant enough to presume to answer that question, but I would like to take a look at part of that with you, the current efforts to restore forest ecosystems. This graphic illustrates the 3 strategies that should be pursued simultaneously. Existing forests are within the circle, showing the critical steps of regenerating forest after sustainable harvesting and restoring forest degraded by unsustainable harvesting or other factors, including fire suppression, overpopulations of ungulates, etc. Outside the circle, there are different pathways for reversing deforestation by restoring forest land use and forest cover where that's appropriate. And these 3 strategies, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself here. Let me back up. These 3 strategies can be summarized thusly. To protect and maintain integrity of existing forests, which means halting deforestation and sustainably managing forests to provide essential ecosystem services. Secondly, to restore the composition, structure, and functioning of degraded forests. And thirdly, reverse deforestation, change land use, and restore forest where they're currently lacking. How does this relate to nature-based solutions, or NBS as it's been abbreviated? Here's 2 examples. The sponge landscape in Vienna of the M. Seebogen neighborhood, or the open space recreation area along the Han River that divides Seoul, South Korea. Now, both of these were built to reduce the impacts of flooding. Originally, NBS was NBS, a soft infrastructural solution to urban environmental problems, a green alternative to gray infrastructure or hard infrastructure. Green infrastructure can be applied at various scales, from the individual home, like rain gardens, to the broader landscape, like wetland preservation, or in these cases, returning floodplains to the rivers. Forests and sustainable management now are included as nature-based solutions in the broader sense of NBS, and that's especially for climate change mitigation. And this has got its own acronym, NBCS, nature-based climate solutions. Some see forests as the climate mitigation answer, a green bullet, if you will. Other voices say, hold on, wait a minute, forests aren't enough. And some would even go so far as to say that the negatives of tree planting campaigns outweigh the positives. Well, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Trees and forests are important, but not the sole solution to climate change. We need to do everything we can, most importantly, cut the cord to fossil fuels. Increasing forest cover can help mitigate emissions. It's very immediate, very easy, and cost-effective at this time. But we should remember that forests provide more than carbon storage. So there's more to this picture than just climate change mitigation. Nevertheless, there's wide support for massive tree planting programs, such as this one in India. But too many of these headline-grabbing initiatives fail. In a recent article on Yale Environment 360, the journalist Fred Pierce writes about phantom forests, why ambitious tree planting programs are failing. He details many high-profile but unsuccessful planting efforts, which puzzles me and leads me to ask why there's so many failures, plantings with less than 20% survival. Well, we know how to plant trees very successfully. Millions of trees, seedlings are planted every year with greater than 90% survival. For example, in the southern US, where I worked for many years before retiring, millions of seedlings were planted annually. So let's be careful about generalizing from a few anecdotal failures. And here's a few caveats to consider. First, we don't really know the full story. A major deficiency of the global forest restoration effort is the lack of reliable data from systematic monitoring beyond the very initial stages of treatments. Very few tree planting initiatives outside of normal forestry reforestation practice invest anything in long-term monitoring. This graphic shows the steps in the planting process. Included within the green circle is the infrastructure that must be in place before planting the very first seedling. The second caveat is that the great motivation to plant trees does not pay sufficient attention to the entire technical process. While the planting process has many important steps, from choosing the right seedlings, doing appropriate site preparation, good planting techniques, good post-planting care, and failure can occur at any of these steps, but planting cannot proceed unless this infrastructure is in place before planting can even begin. The third issue is social context. As our study found, local people need to be involved in the process for restoration to be successful and sustainable. Roughly 5 times of the respondents, people involved in forest restoration projects, agreed to some extent, a lot or moderately or partially, that the success of their forest restoration project depended on stakeholder participation. Now, getting that stakeholder participation is not an easy task, and I don't want to undersell it. It depends on developing a level of trust, which might take years to develop, and could actually start from an adversarial position between stakeholders or between agencies and local communities. And I've seen this in several instances. Added to these trust issues, there are other issues about lack of resources, lack of capacity, or lack of motivation to participate, insufficient attention to social context, in particular, insufficient attention to the needs and the capacity needed for local communities to fully participate, can doom restoration projects to failure. Okay, this much discussed map of potential forest restoration opportunities tried to show that there's somewhere between 1 and 2 billion hectares lacking forest cover globally where forests could grow that potentially could be available for restoration. Although this map shows many hectares in temperate and boreal countries, most of the international attention has focused on the tropics, the global south, which is complicated by tenure and land ownership issues. So efforts to change from land use from non-forest to forest can run into these social problems or lack of clear tenure and clear ownership understandings. An important point in all of this is to remember that land without forest cover, even if it's degraded land, isn't necessarily vacant land. People live there. In some cases, their occupancy may not be considered legal, for example, encroachment into forest reserves or protected areas. Nevertheless, the people are there, they depend on using this land, and their needs have to be considered if a restoration project is going to be sustainable in the long run. Now, a recent analysis of this very map showed this very map at 2 levels by Schultz and colleagues found that the map prioritizes restoration in countries that are poorer, more populated, more economically unequal, less food secure, and that employ more people in agriculture. Sound familiar? Sounds like the tropics, doesn't it? Looking subnationally within the tropics, they found that areas that are less economically developed or more populated are more likely to be top areas considered for restoration. Well, the 4th point is that successful restoration requires the right tree in the right place. The right place means that trees can survive, thrive, and produce positive benefits over time. We can break this down to these 3 criteria. The right tree is a species or a provenance of a species that's adapted to the site, is also adapted to future climate conditions, and able to persist under current and changing climate. Now, because of the uncertainty of the climate response over time, that's a tall order to find the right kind of seedling material to plant. Well, the international policy response has been the Bonn Challenge and the New York Declaration on Forests that targets 350 million hectares in restoration by 2030 or 2050. And that it seeks to recover 17% of the forest cover that's been lost since the Neolithic. So you can see in this graph, we had over 6 billion hectares of forest land, and before the agricultural revolution, we now have about 4 billion hectares. The potential is 1 to 2 billion, and we're talking about less than a third or about a third of a billion. That's a target for restoration. So most recently, the motivation to restore degraded ecosystems has been expanded beyond forests to all ecosystems in the UN Decade on Restoration. So even though we haven't been terribly successful at restoring forests, we're now going to spend a lot more attention and effort at other ecosystems as well. Related policies can also be addressed by forest restoration, including the Aichi targets on the Convention of Biological Diversity and the land degradation neutrality effort of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So FLR, or forest restoration, can meet many of the targeted ideas or targeted restoration needs of the Rio Conventions. Well, implementing forest restoration is a fairly complicated task. Excuse me, I'm a little dry here. Forest landscape restoration, or FLR, as it's known, underpins the Bonn Challenge and the New York Declaration. Implementing FLR is an iterative process, as we tried to show in this graphic here, that has numerous feedback loops. FLR as a concept emerged 20 years ago now as a counterpoint to the top-down development projects, primarily afforestation type projects that ignored the needs of local people. So FLR then is a process, it's not an end in and of itself. And it has technical and social aspects that are intertwined in the twin goals of regaining ecological functionality and enhancing human well-being in deforested or degraded forest landscapes. Not going to go into detail about the Bonn Challenge or any of this, or even about this implementation. There we have a whole guide on this that's now available in 5 languages, soon to be 6. But there's three takeaway messages embedded in this graphic. One, degraded land is a result of people using the land to meet their needs. So FLR has to change land use practice. In the graphic, that's at the bottom there, going from point A to point B, from the current condition to the desired future condition. Too often in FLR projects, though, inadequate consideration is given to monitoring what happens after the initial stages, or to long-term management, or to the effects of climate change. And three, successful restoration can take years to complete, far beyond the usual donor funding cycle of 3 to 5 years. Let's look at this in a little more detail. Getting from point A, the current condition, to point B, the desired future restored landscape, it's not easy or straightforward, and it's not just a technical task. Defining the current condition, point A, and understanding why a landscape is degraded requires delving into landscape history and scanning all the exogenous drivers, such as market forces and government policies that affect land use. Nevertheless, we can characterize or begin to characterize that starting point A by whether there's any forest cover present and what condition it's in, shown here by the numbered degradation stages in the top, upper middle part of the graphic. Going from left to right, increasing degradation from 0 to 5 is correlated with increasing costs and the resources needed for restoration. Up at the top, what's called tipping points there represent some of the barriers that have to be overcome in the different stages. Many different interventions or restoration methods are shown at the bottom, and they're available at the appropriate stages. Let's look at those in a little different way. This table looks at some of the common restoration methods appropriate when forest cover is lacking. In other words, when you have abandoned agricultural land or abandoned pasture, or maybe not so abandoned land, but in any case, there are no trees there. So it looks at this in terms of three important criteria for success: cost, the kind of biodiversity that's provided at the stand and landscape levels, and the speed or the pace of recovery, usually measured in time to canopy development. Now, the methods are evaluated by each criterion and then summarized with an average score on the far right. Of course, this is my own, quote unquote, expert opinion, and it generalizes across all biomes so that the evaluation terms are relative. For example, the slow pace in the tropics likely would be objectively much faster than even the fast pace in the boreal. So 5 years in the tropics versus 30 years or say in the boreal. Nevertheless, it's apparent that active methods shown in the light green in the right column, such as planting mixtures, provides the best overall scores when the criteria are equally weighted. In reality, of course, the weight is in a particular project can be quite different. Often, maybe too often, cost is much more important and given greater weight than diversity or time of recovery. For FLR to be successful, I advocate that it should be implemented in an adaptive management framework, where much effort goes into defining expectations, monitoring stand and landscape development trajectories over time, and using the monitoring information to adjust with further interventions. Now, critical to this framework is specifying the causal connection between the baseline and the desired future. In other words, what's the expected role of the planned intervention? Is it going to actually produce the kind of desired future condition that you want? So sometimes called a theory of change. This drives the choice of indicators to monitor, the expected intermediate conditions, and the trigger points of when to intervene in the future if necessary. Well, I think that FLR can be improved, or at least the implementation as we have it today. FLR as a nature-based solution then is a work in progress. Not all FLR projects meet the actual definition of FLR, and there are many landscape level restoration efforts that are not branded or identified as FLR under the Bond Challenge. To improve FLR implementation, I think there's some steps that are easily defined, but I'll grant you that in truth, these are difficult to achieve. Nevertheless, here's my recipe for success. Clarity, reality, equality, capability, and sustainability. Let me take those in order. Clarity means we must understand and communicate clearly to all interested parties, from stakeholders to politicians to decision makers, what is to be done, and connect that with expected outcomes in terms of ecosystem services. In other words, how's the environment going to be improved, and what does that mean to people? And if appropriate, what are the livelihood benefits that will result? Reality means that we must realize that FLR is a long-term prospect and requires adequate long-term financing of restoration interventions as well as ongoing management. So much attention today is on securing the initial financing for restoration projects, which is a high hurdle to be sure, and an awful lot of it is centered around carbon mitigation, carbon payments, carbon offsets. But little attention has been devoted to how the restored system will be managed, to be managed sustainably, how to sustain restoration once donor support ends. And most projects lack a monitoring plan or the resources to implement one, even if they have a plan. Equality means to ensure fair participation with and within stakeholder groups. Now, participation of stakeholders, especially affected communities, is a key element of the FLR process. It's a defining element, in fact. This requires identifying all affected stakeholders, not just the usual suspects, not just the agencies involved, not just the NGOs. It also means true involvement in the design and implementation phases by stakeholders, especially local communities that will be affected. And this could require training and capacity development, as well as financial support for travel and some financial needs of low-income stakeholders. Within group power dynamics may limit participation of some groups, women, youth, low-status individuals in some cases. This has to be addressed so that everyone has a voice. Long-term, the restored system can become a new asset. So procedures have to be in place for allocating any benefits that arise, and also to avoid elite capture of any new assets. Capability or building capacity in the agencies and localities to be restored, where restoration will occur, could be needed even before a project is conceptualized. The fundamental underpinnings of FLR can be foreign concepts in some societies, including ecological functioning of forest ecosystems and how that relates to community well-being, as well as the whole stakeholder participation process. Capacity development then requires a full range of training and education to gain an understanding of what the FLR process consists of, as well as the technical aspects of restoration methods. In some cases, citizen science or community monitoring is a goal of an FLR process, and that certainly requires technical training. Sustainability involves long-term monitoring and reporting of restoration processes to guide subsequent management. There should be a management plan for the restored forest ecosystem based on stakeholder needs and preferences. Due to the inherent uncertainty of ecosystem dynamics and future climate and external drivers, the management plan likely will need to be modified over time. Effective monitoring and feedback to managers and decision makers should provide an early warning system for significant deviations from the expected trajectory of the restored systems. In other words, giving them a heads up of when they may have to intervene or in some cases change objectives. Well, I'd like to leave you all with a very detailed description of how to conduct successful nature-based forest landscape restoration. Unfortunately, I can't, because FLR is not a one-size-fits-all process. It is totally context dependent. And anyway, I can't predict the future conditions and the future climate, so I will probably be wrong if I try to delineate right now how you should go this in detail. Our challenge together is to do the best we can with the knowledge we have, strive to improve our understanding over time, and react quickly and meaningfully to the novel future that awaits us. I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for this very broad but also comprehensive introduction. I think you touched really really great number of fields and aspects of forest landscape restoration. And yeah, it would be nice more or less to discuss about it. Perhaps I have one question at the beginning so that all the participants can also think about also additional question is, if you think about the improvement of forest landscape restoration, John, what about the role of education? So I missed it a bit. Is it a part of capacity building? But what do you think about the role of education?
Absolutely, Andreas. That's a good point. And in my mind, it is part of capacity development. But I think in order to have the kind of understanding and the practitioners and the facilitators of FLR that we need, people to work at the interface between the communities and the agencies and funding, all that, we need to have well-trained people that have the ecological background, but also have an understanding of social processes to facilitate FLR. And those people need to come out of educational systems, out of universities, technical training schools, master's programs, whatever. So good point. Thank you for bringing that out.
Yeah, thank you. And our first question from the audience is coming from Richard Rimoli. So please ask your question.
Hi, my name is Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I'm a PhD student in Romania and Portugal, and I'm currently studying abandoned land and policies to deal with that and afforestation. And my question is, do you consider that the regeneration of forests in abandoned land are actually restored vegetation, or does it need intervention and management to actually achieve ecological importance or achieve ecological objectives?
Great question, Richard. Yeah, that's actually something. I'll give you a little bit of the history. You may have noticed over time that FLR changed from forest landscape restoration to forest and landscape restoration. Partly that was because of trying to incorporate all different kinds of land uses that can be part of a forest landscape. The other thing that changed over time from the original definition of FLR, it was a planned process. The planning part was taken out because people didn't want it to be like development projects that were top down and imposed. Nevertheless, just ignoring land, barren land or degraded land, and letting it develop vegetation, while it probably does not qualify as forest landscape restoration. It's recovering vegetation, but it may not be vegetation that provides the kind of benefits and functioning that people need in that landscape. Now, if we go back in time and we talk about maybe 100 years ago in some countries where land was abandoned from agriculture and just left to regenerate, in many cases, it was more or less successful because there were the proper seed sources and animals brought in and things, and it was able to regenerate to pretty decently functioning forests. In the kind of degradation that we have today, that's so much more thoroughly degraded land, mined land and things like that, it's hard to see how that's going to come back in a reasonable amount of time. if we're willing to wait 100 years, 200 years for something to be a functioning forest, then you can call that restoration, I guess. But I think the needs that we have in a broad sense, the needs for forest and functioning forests today require the interventions so that we have the species and the composition, the structures we want or need or desire, and also in a timely fashion. So to give you a more definitive answer, I'd have to know the particular context of what the degradation was, what situation that land was in.
Right, thank
But
you.
it's a good point.
Yeah, thanks for this question and answer. And perhaps one comment, I think, as you already mentioned, John, the real challenge, the functional restoration, the restoration of function and not just of tree cover. So I guess this is really a big point and not easy to handle with. So we have another question. I guess the next one is from Za Usquiano. So please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it was very, very interesting talk. Thank you very much. And actually was following because currently I work in a company that we work on trying to restore degraded areas, and I'm in charge of the monitoring, in fact, right? And
Good. Good, somebody's doing monitoring. That's great.
yeah, but like actually it's kind of released to see that or to hear that it's a hard thing, because it's been so hard for me to find proper how to do monitoring long term also, right?
Right.
So in that sense, I would like to know if you have any clear insights. I think that not like yeah, I would like to know your point of view. What do you think is lacking in this kind of things?
Well, going back to my last points on the slide, I think it's critical that the present conditions, or the point A is well described, so that you understand not only what is on the ground, but why it's that way.
Mm-hmm.
Then the next point would be understanding and clearly communicating what your interventions will do to change to get to the restored condition. So having that causal connection being very well understood, that actually tells you the kinds of things that you would like to monitor. So what are you trying to change? So finding indicators of change in that criterion or that characteristic is one point of monitoring. Then you've got all the other considerations. Well, is it going to change quickly enough and significantly enough that I can cost effectively monitor it and see a difference? So you may be interested, for example, in increasing soil carbon and soil sequestration. Well, in the soil, that changes very slowly. So there's certainly no point in monitoring that on an annual basis, because you're not going to see anything. And then, of course, the problem is, how deeply do you sample? Our experience, my experience in the past has been, it's the upper 5 centimeters where I'm going to see any difference in my lifetime. It's probably going to take longer if you're just depending on inputs from the overstory. So you have to balance, what you want to know, and then what's the cost of finding that out, and that's a difficult analysis to make. So I guess I would leave you with two ideas. One is you want to monitor the things that matter, the things that you have set out to change or improve, and then find the right kind or an appropriate monitoring scheme that is at the spatial and temporal scale that's meaningful and also affordable. And I know that sounds like a lot of hand waving, but that's the best I can do without us getting down to the nitty gritty of your particular context.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, there are a lot of people now that are working on the whole monitoring thing and trying to come up with guidelines and resources to help people with that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And definitely I will contact you later. Yeah. But
Okay,
yeah,
good.
it's already this kind of things helps a lot. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah and John. Yes, the next one is more related, or next questions are more related to ecosystem services, starting with the actual topic of carbon sequestration. So we have the COP27 now, and Jillian Petrokovsky is asking you something about this.
This is payback, I think.
Hi, John. Hi, Andres. Great talk, John. No payback at all. This is, I really enjoyed the talk. Lots to think about, as usual. I just noticed on November the 6th that the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change issued a statement at COP27, and they said that nature-based solutions, along with other initiatives they mentioned, like carbon offsets and markets, do not cut emissions and are new forms of colonization. And they ask for real solutions based on their knowledge, practices, and time-tested sciences. And in your talk, you emphasized this issue of social inclusion and participatory.
Did we lose you, Jill?
Jillian, I guess you're muted. May you unmute?
Oh, how much of what I said did you get?
We got to the point of neocolonialism.
Yeah, just colonization. Just whether you wanted to comment on this statement by the International Indigenous Peoples Forum, in the light that FLR, as you say, does pay attention to social inclusion and participatory practices, and the fact that a lot of so-called nature-based solutions really pay very scant attention to these issues, and they are perhaps rather new and not doing what they say they do on the tin in terms of including communities, indigenous communities, and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. One is I think that there is very much a danger of these large-scale initiatives to seem, or maybe are, more driven by let me put on my socialist hat here, more driven by Western societies and their desire to have a better world than it is by understanding the needs of local people. And that's something that FLR really came about to combat, was top down. We know what's best for the landscape and we're going to go in and do it. The other thing I'd point out is the whole thing about traditional knowledge is now coming to the fore. And we have many examples in the Western world, if you will, where we're beginning to give indigenous peoples more control over their former land. For example, the U.S. Forest Service is working with tribes in the United States and actually giving portions of national forest systems to the tribes to manage. In Australia, we have the whole issue of indigenous burning, trying to change the fire management from just managing hazardous fuels to trying to increase the ecosystem benefits of different types of burning. So we're beginning to kind of turn the corner and recognize that, yes, people have lived on the landscape for millennia and they do know something about it, and we would be wise to pay attention to that. I would, however, say that maybe the statement by the indigenous organization, it is a bit for the media. There's a bit of hyperbole there. Understandable that we all do that to gain attention. So I applaud their statement, and I think we need to pay more attention. And that is exactly the kind of thing that I advocate, that we need to incorporate the local people at the very beginning before we even talk about what we're going to do in the conceptualization of the project, not just telling them afterwards, okay, this is what we're going to come and do and make your life better. So thanks for that. Great point.
Thanks, John. Really good point.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for this interesting point brought up. The next question is coming from Stephanie Mansourian, and she deals with the question of priorities in forest landscape restoration. Stephanie, you may unmute.
Are you muted?
Yes, sorry. When you do the connection and ask to join as a panelist, then everything goes dead. That's the problem. Anyway, thanks a lot, John. Nice to see you and nice to hear your talk. I was similarly to Jill, I guess. My question is, you showed the map of the top-down priorities for restoration. Do you have, or can you discuss good examples of where you can actually reconcile those top-down priorities for restoration and ways of defining a restoration, an FLR process in a location with the bottom-up needs and desires of the local communities? How do we get to that? And have you got examples of where that has actually worked?
Isn't that your talk in March? You're going to tell us how to do it? You're the governance expert. Okay, let me see if I can address that. I think as you and I know from sort of looking at FLR from the inside, if you will, a lot of the commitments that have been made have been top-down commitments made by national decision makers without much understanding of how it's actually going to be implemented. So the things that we're seeing implemented very often, you and I would not even call FLR. It's maybe changing local land uses for the better, but not necessarily balancing livelihood and biodiversity needs or ecological integrity needs. So how do we do that? Well, I think that it's a very difficult thing to do when you're starting out, because a lot of it depends on a level of trust between the local people and their priorities and understanding and the people who are trying to make changes. Because if you're changing someone's livelihood, so the thing that's the foundation of their livelihoods, without really talking to them about that or gaining their trust, then there's going to be a lot of local opposition, and you're not going to make much progress in reconciling priorities. So I don't have a great answer, I'm afraid. And I can point to some examples, not so much from my personal involvement, but from some case studies that I've read in different places where it's obvious that it's been a long-term process of developing the trust and, in effect, redesigning the restoration to begin to meet the needs of people as those needs have been able to be expressed and to come out. Because it takes more than just going into the community with a survey instrument and saying, what would you like to have changed? Because usually it's well, I want better schools or better roads or access to markets. It's not really getting at what an FLR project can directly provide. So do you have some examples? Let me throw it back to you.
No, I'll answer that in March. But I do think that when we're talking about monitoring and when we're talking about priority setting, we have to be aware of those two extremes and the fact that we somehow need to reconcile the views that maybe external experts have and the desires of the local community that has to live with the restored landscape. And that's a tension that, yeah, we still haven't quite found the right solutions for that, I think.
Right. Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for this. Perhaps one comment, I guess, in terms of transforming forest landscape. trust is a very critical factor and can be spoiled easily, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a next question. I think this is also very interesting about the role of NGOs and also private initiatives for FLR, and that's coming from Jose Rodriguez. Jose, may you unmute your microphone? Yes, speak up, please.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, Jose.
Sorry, there
we
was
hear
a
you.
delay. Okay, thank you. Cheers, John. Thanks for the great talking. I'm speaking from Brazil. I'm also from a technical monitoring. I'm part of the monitoring technical coastal ecosystem restoration in Brazil. I'm part of Eden, is a Institute of Reforestation. And I have this question. It's more related to the governance support. So we all know that most of the restoration projects are supported by NGOs or private fundings, and most of them are short-term projects. So my question is, would a big and organized government program be more feasible to support long-term projects? And like, would it be viable for the next few years?
Well, I don't think government projects are any more long-term usually than NGO projects. I mean, usually the government projects are grant or they're grant-based, so they're just like a donor. So they usually have a 3 to 5 year cycle. Unfortunately, that's the case. I think that today there's much emphasis on blended financing, it's called. So a blending of private sector and public sector financing. And the truth is, even with all of the money that's being talked about, it's nowhere near meeting the needs. So it's going to be critical over time that both public and private or corporate and government funding is directed towards these problems. Solving this problem of short-term donor funding versus long-term sustainability of projects is one that has to be addressed within the project. So if the benefits that are motivating the communities to maintain the restored system intact are based just on the things that they're getting from the donors without any long-term benefits, then it's going to fail. Now, those long-term benefits don't necessarily have to be financial if the people understand that, yes, what we have done is going to improve their water quality. It's going to improve, in particular, it will reduce some of the extreme temperatures that many parts of the world are facing today and will continue to face it unless we get global warming under control. People have to understand that there are non-financial, non-economic benefits from restoration, and they have to value those for the restoration to be sustainable over the long term. And I think that's the only way that we're going to overcome this problem, if you will, of short-term financing versus long-term sustainability. I wish I could give you a more optimistic answer, but I think that's where I come down right now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. There is still a big challenge.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. And we have also one question, I think very interesting question about the interesting relationships of biodiversity conservation and FLR. And the question will be given by Daira Linke. So please speak up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a master's student at the University for Sustainable Development in Eberswalde. And I'm kind of wondering how biodiversity conservation can be more incorporated into restoration projects, and what do you think is most important to consider? Yeah.
Well, to truly be FLR, biodiversity is part of it. That's the ecological integrity goal is for a biodiverse landscape. I think the thing to understand is we're talking about diversity not just at the stand or small scale, but diversity at the landscape scale. So biodiversity concerns should be given equal weight with livelihood concerns. Now, that's not always possible in practice, but I think that for many reasons, a diverse mosaic type of landscape with a lot of different land uses and a lot of different forest types and forests in different stages is going to be the most sustainable and give us the best prospect of getting through some of the challenges that climate change is going to bring. So there's also, you know, at another extreme sort of restoration is ecological restoration, which is very much focused almost exclusively, if not primarily, on the biodiversity aspect. So in some parts of the degraded landscapes that occur, biodiversity would be the primary concern. And this is going to be more and more prevalent as we have more and more degradation problems with climate, where large, as we're already experiencing, large areas of tree death, a combination of drought and insect infestation with megafires. A lot of this is occurring in areas where the livelihood issue is not so directly of a concern, but the biodiversity issue is. And making our restoration and our treatment of those degraded areas incorporating biodiversity, but also the need to restore robust systems under a changing climate and changing future climate. So for example, all of the Norway spruce forests that have died in Central Europe, do you really want to plant Norway spruce back? I think a better option would be a more diverse landscape with certainly conifers and as well as a much more higher percentage of broadleaves and a more diverse landscape. So hang in there. Biodiversity is going to and should be very much a topic of landscape restoration.
Thank you. And but one point comes into my mind is also the question which might be related is the use of native or non-native species, because, you know, with both you can achieve biodiversity, but I think the perception to non-native species, I think it's quite controversial. Perhaps John, you may also say some words about this.
Sure. Yeah, I think we probably have somewhat different viewpoints on that. You know, let me back up and just be a little philosophical here. You know, one of the issues with ecological restoration in the past has been, if you're trying to restore to some idealistic historic landscape without regard to the changes in landscape and the changes due to climate change and human pressures, then you're throwing a lot of money at an unattainable goal. I think the same sort of thing applies today if we don't understand that as conditions change, our desires, our expectations for what is native and non-native needs to change as well. This, of course, is very largely a perception issue. You know, different countries, different societies have different ideas. I want a forest like my grandfather walked in is probably not something that's going to be attainable in many cases. So if we can have functioning forests, it should be okay to bring in non-native species if it's species that are somewhat similar to the ones we have today. So in effect, surrogates. So, you know, we've talked about this whole issue of assisted migration, and it's been controversial. And I'll just make a plug that I'm editing a special issue of Forest Ecology and Management on forestry and assisted migration. So if you have information about this and you want to submit a paper, we're open for business right now. So my colleague over here is smiling at me. That's a real, I mean, that's a huge issue, Andreas. And we should have a whole seminar. We should have a whole webinar on that issue, I think.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of different things
right.
that I think we would want to bring out there. Yeah, because it's not just non-native, but it's also the whole issue of using biotechnology to bring in new traits into native species. So, for example, the restoration of some species that have been extirpated because of non-native pests, like.
So it seems that we have some connection problems. Okay, then one comment from my side is also, if we talk about the criteria on native and non-native, might be, I think, more important to discuss about invasiveness. So invasive versus non-invasive, but this is my personal perspective. So let's look if we can rebuild the connection to John. Otherwise, we are also quite near to our time limit, I guess. So we have seen that we should be more or less from 4 o'clock to 5:30. So, and it's a pity that I cannot more or less than thank John for his excellent talk, but I can thank all of the audience to the excellent questions and the discussion. I think that would be really, that was really very interesting and fruitful. So I suggest to give you, Gesche, the word for more or less the closing. And yes, so the floor is yours, Gesche. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And I think we can maybe agree, in case John comes back, to have one final question for John, and then I take over.
Okay, John, but he's now frozen again, I guess. So.
Okay. Yeah, it seems it doesn't work. Yes, we can hear you. Even if you do it without the microphone, without the video, it's fine. To have one final question, then I take over. Oh no, we have you twice. That's even nicer.
Exceeded my allotment of time, so I went back to the computer, but the computer
I think it doesn't work. So Gabby, please go back to the presentation. And once John is back and he can maybe hear us, you can at least thank him, Andreas. But for now, I noticed that well, we've collected a couple of new topics for upcoming webinars. Although we've already decided on a couple of topics, but there are more topics, obviously, that are really pressing on the agenda, like, for instance, the topic of biotechnology and the species selection, and also Well, biodiversity has been mentioned. It is crucial. It's a crucial motivation for landscape restoration, but it's the kind of objective behind it, but it's also something that is in many cases needed to restore successfully. So this is something we will focus on in our next webinar, which is happening on the 14th of December, and you can already register now. And we will have Bart Muijs from Kai Leuven, who will speak to us about biodiversity as a key asset for forest restoration in Europe. So this will be the European focus then. And then please, next slide, Gabby. And then we already have plans for January, where we will have Markus Höhl from Germany, who will speak on forest landscape restoration and local community involvement. And this is also something that has been tackled today and addressed, and it's something that is often forgotten in those big projects that actually we need to take the local communities into not just into consideration, but really engage and make them key actors of the process. Then on the 8th of February, we will have some of our superb work package leaders. They come from different universities from Spain, from Germany, and we will present you, and this will be a little bit of a different format then. We will present you what we know about forest condition in Europe and also the actual restoration needs. This also, of course, includes a practical perspective. Then on the 8th of March, we will have Stephanie Mansourian, who has already asked a question today, so you already know her face. And she will, together with Mercy Durkee, speak on governments commit to forest restoration, and then also, but like what it takes, or explore what it takes to restore forests. So she will look at it from a governance perspective. And then on the 12th of April, we will have Giorgio Vacchiano from University of Milan, who will talk about the how, the where, and the don'ts of tree planting. So a lot of webinars to look forward to, and also different formats that you can be expecting. Thank you very much for participating in this wonderful webinar. And I would like to give the final word to Andreas. Thank you very much also for great moderation from our side. And let's see if we got John back.
Yeah, thank you, Gesche, and I hope John can hear it. So thank you very much. I think this was a perfect introductory talk to our webinar series. So I'm really looking forward also to the next contributions. And I do apologize for all of the people who raised some questions we could not answer. So I already sent also the email address of John Stanturf to one of our participants. So you may ask John or me or our audience, so that you get more or less the data, that you get in contact. So I really like more or less all the atmosphere within this talk today. So it's really nice, and I hope you will come back to the next event in the next month. So I think this is really a brilliant start of our monthly restoration talk series. And thanks also, and of course, to Gesche and the EFI more or less for setting the technical frame. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. I will never forget the name of the IUFRO task force anymore now. That's a promise. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening or a good day, depending on which in which zone you are all over the world. And we will keep in touch. Bye-bye.